Today we are joined by Kevin Budelmann, who is the president and co-founder of Peopledesign, a leading strategy design firm helping clients with their business strategy, brand identity, and marketing programs. Kevin also co-wrote Brand Identity Essentials and is faculty at Northwestern University and Michigan State University. Kevin, welcome to Buffering.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate being here, and nice to join both of you today.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. We really appreciate you jumping on with us. I thought it would be fun to kind of start with how we got connected with you. This was John DeRocher actually connected us after he sent us. John sends Zach and I a lot of like random things from LinkedIn, you know, like, hey, here's an article you should read, or hey, here's something cool that I found. And he sent us an article that you wrote about S-curve adoption, which is really what we're going to dive into and kind of the main topic today. But one of the other fun things that we found out after we got connected with you is that you and your brothers actually went to high school with John way back in the day.
That's right. Well, it's so funny. It's the miracle of social networks today. It's funny because I hadn't really run into John in a long time, but as you say, my John is sort of my brother's age, a couple of years older than me. But the three of us actually used to do quite a bit of cycling together in high school, and so used to do workouts and everything together. So it's funny how, you know, many years later, here I am, you know, posting articles on LinkedIn, you know, which we promote for our, you know, try to promote our ideas and for our clients and so on. And who should pop up with John DeRocher, which I thought, you know, and it's funny. I wound up texting my brother and said, guess who showed up on LinkedIn on my article. So,
That's awesome.
So yeah, pleased that he did, and happy that he shared it with you guys.
Gabe, wasn't it a few episodes ago I said back 20 years ago you could move, you know, a mile away and have a whole new life, whereas today with social media, you know, you get these connections from years past.
It's probably the good thing and the bad thing of social media is sometimes you can't get away from people, but you know, we'll take this as the positive one. We were cracking up too as when we connected a little bit earlier, just to do some preparation for the podcast, and you would mention the working out thing, and you're like, oh, does he still do that? And we were joking that everybody around here calls him Johnny Fitness, and that Zack has been ashamed because he had to like walk away from him on Strava because John was just putting him to shame. So yes, he's still very much into exercising and working out.
That's great. Well, I am not surprised.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to getting into the topic today. So the article that you wrote was again around S-curve adoption, and specifically the thing that really interested Zach and I that again we want to get into here, and kind of the second topic is jumping S-curves. But could you tell us just a little bit about what S-curve adoption is, and as business people, how we should be thinking about it during kind of like market life cycles and product life cycles?
Absolutely. Sure. All right. Thanks for that. So yeah, I think that so first of all, you know, one of my favorite quotes is that all models are false and some are useful. Right. So which is to say that, you know, models are just a way of kind of understanding the world, a way of kind of, provides a lens on reality. And, you know, the idea of viewing product, company, or even industry growth on kind of on a cyclical pattern kind of way is a way to kind of understand and sort of think about phases of these entities. And so, you know, there's this general idea of thinking about it as an S curve, which is to say you can imagine almost like a sine wave, you know, moving from starting at the bottom, kind of at the startup level, through growth, through maturity, and a sort of eventual decline. And you can sort of imagine, you know, analyzing again, like I said, a product, a program, a service, a company, or, you know, really whole industries as being at different states, you know, within that sort of growth cycle. And sort of understanding where you are can inform your actions. It has an impact on how people think about risk and innovation. You know, and there are risks to a business in terms of, you know, not knowing where you are on that growth cycle can sometimes inhibit, you know, your future vitality as a business. If you think about, you know, it can be kind of a trap, because businesses that are mature or industries that are mature or even on the decline are in a position where there's a lot of money to be made at those stages, even if
Hmm.
things are declining. But there's a risk of becoming obsolete if you don't understand where you are in that pattern.
Well, and that's the part that really got us interested in this topic is thinking about how it relates to the broadband industry specifically, which is the primary thing that Zach and I talk about most of the time. There's a discussion right now of whether the broadband industry is becoming a commodity, and I think that's a very dangerous way for our customers to be thinking for lots of reasons. But it does get to that point of, like you said, business maturity, where they're at on that scale, and then how companies could potentially transition out of that commodity space by looking at where they're at in that product adoption or market adoption life cycle.
Yeah, it's very much true. I mean, as I think about, a lot of our work, as you mentioned at the top, is in the brand space. And, brand building, a lot of brand building is about trying to fight commoditization, right? So you're trying to, why would any customer pay anything above the lowest possible price that the marketplace offers? And the difference is that there's a perceived sense of value that's being delivered. And companies that have a clear picture of what that value is, it can really double down on that and actually capitalize on that. But and so much of that is, as you mentioned, if you overlay this idea of a growth cycle and a growth curve, trying to stay ahead of that change, knowing where you are, knowing where your competitors are, knowing where the industry is, can help inform your strategy for remaining remaining alive on into the future.
Nothing, no big deal. Just remaining alive. Nothing.
Yeah,
Nothing
there you go.
overstated.
Yeah.
Well, Zach, I'll transition to you because I know you wanted to talk about some of the jumping the S curve piece.
Yeah, and Gabe, as we talked about the S scores, one of the things that we talked about prior to this podcast was the importance to jump. And Kevin, I know the broadband industry might be fairly new to you, or it's a unique environment to really have these conversations in. But I'd be curious to know your thoughts here on why it's important for businesses, even broadband service providers today, to jump an S curve.
Yeah, sure. So the article that I wrote was based in part on a book that was published some 10 or 15 years ago by some guys from Accenture called Jumping the S Curve. And they basically put forward this idea that if the idea of growth cycles being on an S curve is not a new one. But they posited that, if you think about S curves and you kind of line them up together and as a kind of a ladder, they kind of build over time, there's this idea that if your product or your company or your industry is in the mature phase or declining phase, that you should be actively seeking the next growth cycle, the next opportunity to sort of rethink your aspects of your business as almost like a startup. And what is that next wave? Where is the next wave of growth going to come from? What is that sort of next wave of innovation? And it can be so much of the book highlights how much it can be. It's a mistake or it can be a risk if you're imagining that your past success is going to lead to your future growth, because too often companies find themselves kind of flat-footed because they're not recognizing how much the world has changed around them, and so actively looking for ways of trying to identify what is that next wave of growth, what's the next wave of growth for a company, or for, as you mentioned, sort of a whole industry. So and the book kind of maps out a number of ways that might happen.
And Gabe, this is a conversation I think I know I have almost daily. I'm sure you have as well. Gabe, is 20 years ago, these companies we work with started deploying fiber in the ground, or the latest technology in the ground, and since then, the way they've sold it and operated their businesses and marketed their services hasn't changed. We're still talking about broadband technology and of course speed and price. And Gabe, I think that ties right into a conversation we have every day. Is okay, well, we're selling the same things like we did 20 years ago. What's next for our business? What's next for the organization we're in?
Hmm. Yeah, and the part that I started really thinking about, Kevin, when we were reading your article and then talking to you about this is I totally agree with you that sometimes it's like, hey, we need to completely launch a new product or new service. Zach and I had this conversation on a podcast a number of months ago about the book Lead and Disrupt, where it's that follow up
Hmm.
to the innovator's dilemma of how to set up your organization to make sure that you are ready to disrupt. You're almost disrupting your existing business to then lead into a new business, which I
Right.
think aligns really nicely
Right.
to the S curve, jumping the S curve piece of this. But there is
Hmm.
certainly okay, we have to think about new services. We have to think about new products that our customers would be interested in. But I also think there's a big component of this of jumping an S curve could be, hey, we just need to start thinking about packaging and discussing our products in a very different way. And that goes back to some of the brand stuff that you were talking about a moment ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we chat about this a moment, but before we got on the air too. I think that there's, Zach, as you mentioned, I don't have a lot of direct experience in your industry per se, but we do done a lot of work in the space of companies that are looking to jump the S curve in various fronts and brand innovation. And it's like we talked about, you have to recognize kind of the macro picture of what's happening in people's lives. So, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of our clients, for example, we serve companies that help support the built environment. So, architecture and office buildings and furniture and those sorts of things. And, these guys have been enormously disrupted by the technology innovation on the other side of COVID, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic has led to everyone to start working from home, or many people working from home. And there's a big debate about returning to office or and not and so on. But
Oh man, I'm not touching that one with a
and
10-foot
that's like
pole, Kevin. But yeah.
exactly that will go on and on, right? I mean, it's some people would argue that it's generational and like there's lots of things, but I think I think it's in my mind anyway. The pendulum is already kind of just sort of settled in a different place, different
For
than it
sure.
was, let's say 10 years ago. And I think that will continue on into the future. So the reason I bring that up though is, to me that, conceivably spells opportunity in the broadband space. I mean, here I am working from home. I don't know if you guys are also working from home. Suddenly
Yep.
if your home office becomes your dominant, pathway for working, which is true for me and my team, we're all remote, right? And it's like I had a call yesterday where I've got a supplier who's they're based in Texas. I've got a guy in Seattle. There are developers in England. There are people on the West Coast and on the East Coast. And here we're, there's 10 people on the phone and they're all working remotely, right? So like, what is that, what opportunities does that spell for broadband in terms of how it's packaged, sold,
Mm-hmm.
and and what, it's funny how like, so the packages that are offered to my wife and I are, all about like getting HBO at high speeds or whatever, which is okay, that's helpful, or Netflix or whatever, right? But like, the reality is it's an anchor for our business. So what would we be willing to pay, to ensure reliability, speed, et cetera? And it's funny because I think it's, again, it blends what might be, for example, a commercial offering versus a residential offering. At some point, there's a good chunk of our house that's essentially our business at this point, right? So
Yeah, for sure.
it's very interesting how, so, and I don't know, I wouldn't have, pretend to know the answers to your industry in that way, but it's like, you can imagine providers repackaging how they are positioning these products and services in terms of what are you actually offering and how are you offering it. And I think it's just, it's an opportunity to try to, start to find ways to sort of differentiate.
And it goes back to what problem are we trying to solve, Gabe? That's a conversation we have, a lot. Is what's the problem of our customers or the end subscriber, and how can we fill that gap? How can we solve that problem? Which does kind
Yep.
of transition us here, Gabe, to another topic, um, rational versus emotional decision making. And I think we've always talked about. We think every consumer is rational. Or we always say like the average consumer, which is kind of a term I've grown to hate a little bit. But the reality
Mhm.
is, Gabe, I don't think that really exists because people are buying on emotion.
This used to drive me insane in economics class back in college because we would always, the professor would always be saying, things like, "We'll assume a rational consumer," and I think that's so false. And I think there's actually been some research over the last decade or so that shows that like economics research that shows that actually consumers are not rational at all, and we may think we're rational, but the reality is, and Kevin, you said this in the prep, is we're making emotional decisions and then we're justifying it with a rational way of thinking about it. But it's we're doing the rational part of the thinking subsequent to the emotional part of the thinking.
Yeah, it's very much it's so much of an archetype that we it's fully baked into our process in terms of how we work with our
Mm-hmm.
customers. And it isn't to say that completely are that it isn't to say that people are completely irrational, but it is to say that many choices in our lives are made on emotional and gut feel and a sense of belonging and avoiding risk or avoiding embarrassment or trying to look like somebody or something I want to do. Like there's so much baked into this. And it's one of these things where, in the world of behavioral psychology, behavioral science, these concepts are pretty well understood, and
For
I
sure.
think, and I think, but they're not, and in some respect, so let's say advertising circles, if you watch a Super Bowl commercial, like what are those things about, right? A lot of it is, they are trying to trigger emotional responses. And it's,
Mm-hmm.
as you said, what happens is we sort of envision human beings, we envision ourselves as being very logical people, and we going through the world, but it's just not how it works. I mean, part of the reason we're called people design is that we're trying to focus on human-centered approaches, which are trying to take that kind of thing into account. And, so much so, that we literally structure marketing messages in two beats, right? There's sort of this inspiring with emotions and then reassuring with facts. That isn't to say that the facts don't conceivably also inspire, but often if you're trying to inspire a customer, just loading them up with more facts doesn't help, right? And
No,
it's too often it's a common mistake among a lot of product and service providers.
Oh, 100%. I remember reading something. This has been a while. I did a presentation on it a number of years back, but it was talking about it was a nonprofit organization. And they did a test where they basically gave everybody $5 and you come into this room and they tell you a story about a child who is suffering in another country. And then they told the story to one group and then they gave a bunch of statistics to another group. And then they did a combination of both of those things. And it was a little bit of a story and then a little bit of the statistics. And the people who donated, then at the end of it, it was like, well, you can donate your $5 back if you want to help this particular community. Without fail, the larger dollar amount came from the combination of story backed up and supported with facts. And I think there's definitely something to take away there from a business perspective as well. Is like you said, it's, hey, how can we hook people emotionally to talk to them about the product or service or whatever that we're trying to sell, and think about that unmet need that they have as a consumer, but then follow that up with the supporting facts and statistics to help them justify that decision that they just made.
Yeah, it's very true.
The
I think it's, it kind of goes into the, there's really this idea that, what you are trying to elicit among your customers is a kind of a more passionate response. I mean,
Mhm.
the bigger mistake is not thinking that they're going to love or hate you. It's just really they love or hate, or they just don't care. And the commoditization factor plays into the marketplace when basically customers just don't care. They don't see a difference, and so they're not going to pay for a difference, and they're going to the switching costs are seem low, and so why wouldn't they switch for a slightly better deal? And I think that's
Mhm.
when you're fighting commoditization, in some respects, what you're doing is you're fighting the fact that they don't care.
Yep,
Because the facts
absolutely.
to them the facts look the same. Whereas I think if you start to sort of sell on a more emotional trigger, it begs the question about what do people actually care about.
And this goes back to our
Well,
episode last week, Gabe, even where we talked about the language you use in your marketing, how you talk
mhm.
to people. We used the term, I stole it from Reddit, but explain it like I'm five. Use that language that's not super technical. Um,
Mhm.
Going back to that comment there of if consumers see your products and services the same as your competitors, of course they're going to, find the one that's cheaper. I think we've all done this by by this point now too. So, what is that added value? How are you going to show them you're better? Gabe, we talked about even the customer testimonials, talking about who was buying the services and how they used it versus, oh, we came out and we did a fiber to the home project and we can now do 2x2, gigabits per second. This story is going to resonate with people much better than the technicalities or the I don't want to say like the facts or the broadband label of your offering.
Yep. Well, it gets to, Zach, I know we talked about this a little bit in the prep as well, your favorite company, Apple, and what they've done. And Kevin, you mentioned this. You used this word, and I thought it was really good. They're a polarizing brand, and what I thought was really interesting in thinking about this is that they don't want to be for everybody. They want to be for a really specific group of people, and because that's their approach, they're able to charge a significant premium over a commoditized laptop that you can go, I bought my son a Chromebook for school. It's like $150, right? Like I'm not going to buy him a $2,000 MacBook. He doesn't need that. But,
Mm-hmm.
but there are lots of good products out there that you can get that are much less expensive than an Apple product. But again, they've thought about, well, how are they going to be perceived? And thinking about the fact that they're, again, not for everybody.
Yeah, I think there are, again, sort of macro forces. We can talk about macro forces in terms of like where we are pre and post COVID,
Hmm.
but there's even more macro. We're moving beyond essentially an industrial economy that's based on scale and solving a scarcity problem. And so we're a post-industrial society that we all, in our first world countries live in. Um, the problem is no longer about scarcity. It's about choice. And you've got to give people a reason to choose your product or service that is actually meaningful to the people you're trying to appeal to, because they have plenty of choices. In fact, I mean, that's one of the biggest hallmarks of the era today. So yeah, as you mentioned, a company like Apple, and there are others. I mean, some of the most beloved brands are also polarizing because they have made this in the leadership team has decided that they are pursuing a particular demographic, psychographic, use case, customer group, that's trying to solve a particular kind of a problem. And they frankly don't care as much about others. And I think that, if historically that used to be kind of like, treason to say like, no, we care about all customers equally, right?
I would say it's
And that's
blasphemous
just
to say that you don't care about everybody, but
blasphemous.
it's.
Yeah, but it's just not the way it works, because there's so much choice today
Mhm.
that you have to be more, the brands and companies and products and services that'll stand out are the ones that are more meaningful. And in order to and to be more meaningful, it it begs the question about how much do you actually know about your customer,
Mhm.
right? Do you actually know what they're trying to do? Or are they just kind of a number, or some kind of a, the reality is people don't, in the same age, gender, or income, don't necessarily behave the same way.
Yeah, for
We
sure.
talk about, so Apple's a great example. Walk into the Apple store and you see people of all ages, all income brackets, all, but there's a common denominator there, and that's what they pursue.
Absolutely. Well, and it's sort of, this is a nice transition potentially to this last topic here about how recommendations of how to jump S curves. And one thing I was thinking about as you were going through that is, maybe jumping an S curve is actually firing some customers and thinking differently
Yeah.
about the customers that you actually do want to have. Again, when we talk about, when Zach and I talk to broadband service providers, a lot of times the target market is everybody, because everybody can buy the internet and everybody can use the
Right.
internet.
Right.
Well, while that is true, there is a specific group of people that, if you're trying to build a brand, if you're trying to build a loyal following, there are likely a specific group of people that you want to go after. And it's also likely that that particular set of people are willing to pay more for your service if you're framing it up in the correct way. So Zach, I know you want to talk about this, like that, other recommendations to jump S curves, but I think that's an important one for people to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely, Gabe. And I think it kicks the Kevin back, or the question back to Kevin here is, for businesses wanting to jump that S curve, is there a formulated approach they should be taking to modify their business model?
Yeah, there are lots of ways to do it. I mean, there's lots of books on innovation and growth and so on. This is, like I said, this is a helpful model if you think about. So, first of all, I think that the idea of thinking about S curves and jumping S curves is just a mental model to try to understand, what is actually happening. Like, what is the state of broadband today? Broadly, or in my marketplace, or what's the state of any particular product or service? Is it mature and making a lot of money, but on the decline, or is it growing like crazy? Um, all of, so there's a lot that can be gained by just understanding like where are we today, right? And then I think, looking outside of the industry is super helpful. I think industries tend to get part of the commoditization is that a lot of players, we tell our clients this all the time, it's like they all show up to the same trade shows, read the same trade publications, use the same metrics, and they all start using the same language, and you all mean something to each other, but it may be meaningless to your client. I mean, I even say, and again, being a novice in this, what does broadband even mean today? What does that even, like, I don't know what you're saying. Like, like today, it's just, you know what I'm saying? It's just like, I don't even know.
Yes,
it just
I
sounds
know
like
exactly
a word,
what you mean.
Gabe, didn't I ask you a few months ago what the definition of broadband was? Like,
Right.
We did.
like we're in the industry, and it's not a term I like.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good, it's one of the, again, looking outside of your own kind of bubble, industry or otherwise. You were talking earlier, Gabe, about your child. I mean, I talk to my kids who are, they're all teens and, early 20s, and they're like, just even the way they view the world. If I said the word broadband to them, I wouldn't even think, I literally wouldn't even know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? These guys grew up with phones, and they don't know what, phones with cords even are. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So it's not like they think about this in this way, right? So I, from our perspective, Zach, to your question, seek to better understand what's actually happening on the ground in people's lives. Their humans' worlds are not divided into your industries, right? Humans are just trying to solve problems. They, in my case, I've got a home office. I also want to watch TV or whatever, internet service. Um, but if my next door neighbor, who again might be in the same zip code, might behave totally differently than me and might have totally different values. And so the company or product or service that is targeting someone like me might be very different than someone else who's here. So it's sort of a, and the reality is we might have a whole bunch of choices, in our minds that might be all the same, unless it's up to you guys and your customers to, seek to differentiate, use different language, offer something that's more meaningful. And to your point, Gabe, I mean, it's like if you offer something that's something somebody really wants, Apple being a case, you can charge a lot more. I mean,
Yes.
Apple has a smaller portion of the market, but they're raking in most of the profits, right?
Yep,
So
exactly.
it's just a business strategy question.
Yep. Yeah, Zach and I talk about their
I love the
services
example
business all the
of
time.
people using your products and services different too. If you recall, Gabe, last year when my neighborhood was built out with fiber, my neighbor who was I don't know how many years older than me, mid 60s, is came down and said, "Oh well, why should I switch to this? Or why would I need 1 gig, 2 gig, 5 gig?" And all I could think of was, I know why I would need it. Uploading the podcast, gaming, streaming. But you're not doing any of that. So yeah, it went back to how can, in my case, sell another company's service to my neighbor? How is this going to best resonate? And of course, it ended up with like is the 5G the same as the, the the other 5G we know about as internet? And I'm like, well, no, that's a different thing. And then I had to go down that
Right.
path explaining that. But it goes back to everyone's
Yeah.
needs changing. And then, again, telling the story of how this product or service is going to, I don't want to say change your life, but maybe fill that need you have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think, what is your product or service in the mind of your customer, and what do you want it to be? I think it's part of it, it's very easy to get trapped in industry jargon, and often your customers don't understand the industry jargon. I mean, they don't know what you're talking about, or either it's a term that it's just done is served to confuse. There's always a 5G, a 6G, a 7G. Like, what do you, like, and again, I'm being a little facetious, but I mean, but it's true. I think, and we find this to be true with a lot of our customers, and it's like trying to understand how the customers understand. And and one of the challenges is there's not a straight line here. You can't, it's a tenet of kind of user research that we lean into, that you can ask customers what they want, but they can't tell you what they need. Like, nobody asked for a smartphone, like literally nobody, right? So, and yet we're all using
nobody
them.
knew they wanted it until it existed.
Yeah,
but that's why it's so
exactly.
important to watch what customers do.
Exactly. It's serving an unmet need. It's like any business is built on an unmet need. What are the unmet needs in the marketplace?
Absolutely. Yep. Well, Kevin, this was awesome. We really appreciate the time and the conversation. If folks want to get in contact with you, we'll certainly add your website into the show notes. But if they're interested in this topic further, any other ways that they can get in contact with you?
Sure. I mean, the website peopledesign.com is probably the easiest, first place. But I'm also on LinkedIn and all the usual social channels. But starting with a website is probably the best thing. So yeah,
Awesome.
I appreciate very much the invitation for the show.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning into Buffering. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to give us a follow on your favorite podcast app and to share it with your friends and colleagues. And for more insights, be sure to connect with Gabe, Kevin, and I on LinkedIn.